right, so I'm really happy to get the opportunity to present here today. The research I'm going to talk about was like super fascinating about a year ago. I hope you're still not too bored when talking about COVID, but the good news is I'm going to talk about something you can hopefully all relate to, and something that actually happened at the very beginning where things were still much more exciting. At least that's what our results show too. So this is basically a study we did mostly last spring and summer with a team mostly in Vienna, where we looked at collective emotions on Twitter. So because this is such a relatable topic, I kind of want to take advantage of that and ask you all to reflect a little bit about how you felt and at what time and why, and then maybe what you did because you felt that way. Because I think it makes the results much more interesting. At least that's what happened for me. It's most of it was pretty relatable, and maybe you're going to be surprised that all other people felt differently from what you experienced, but I expect that most of you felt something quite similar to what I'm going to show you now, because the patterns were actually quite similar across many different countries we looked at. So take a moment and just try to think about in the early phase of the outbreak, so the first 5 weeks after the outbreak, how did you feel? And whenever I say outbreak in this talk, I basically mean the first 5 weeks after the day with 30 cases. So of course, some countries reacted a bit earlier, some a bit later, but this was kind of a period that worked well with the data we had. So when did you experience most anxiety? Was that really, really early on before everyone else was starting to worry? Was that just before the lockdowns? Was it still afterwards? When was it strongest? And what did you do at that time, especially on social media? Were there moments where you felt sad? You felt you were missing things? Was that around the time of a lockdown maybe, or was that already before when you were anticipating what was going to happen? Or was it later when you started to realize what you missed most? And maybe the most kind of tricky question, at least for me, it would be if I hadn't seen my data, is when did I feel more or less angry or frustrated about what was happening in the early 5 weeks? And here it's really important that you think about how frustrated you're usually about what's happening in your country. So think about Twitter mostly being a place where people talk about everyday politics and how much they complain there usually about what's happening, and then how happy or angry actually were they in comparison to how angry they're usually, and how was that for you? And then finally, did you also see some of the aspects of the situation in a positive light? At least at the beginning. I think this might be very different by now. Lots of these, of the results I'm going to show you might be really different actually by now. So if you let me translate this into more official research questions, we basically looked at how people emotionally responded to the COVID-19 outbreak in different countries around the world. And we mostly focused on what was similar between these countries. And we also wanted to know whether this was actually a collective emotional phenomenon. So with collective here, I mean that people actually socially responded to each other's emotions. So that they shared how they felt, and they felt things also because other people around them were feeling these things, and not just because everyone sat alone at home and experienced the same thing by coincidence at the same time because we were exposed to the same events, but that there was also some kind of social interaction that influenced how we felt. And finally, we looked a little bit into whether COVID-19 cases might have also played a role in explaining when different emotions increased or decreased. And I do have a background in cognitive neuroscience, like Simon said at the very beginning, but originally I come from psychology. And so in psychology, that what I'm going to present you is kind of the basic view on why different emotions occur, under what circumstances, and why that might be the case. And so this is kind of the argument for why we chose to look at the emotions that I just asked you about before. So we basically focused on emotions that are relevant to pandemic behavior and risk communication. We first of all, of course, looked at anxiety, because anxiety usually occurs when when people don't have clear explanations for what's happening, when they're really uncertain about what's going to happen next, and when they don't know how to cope with a threat, right? Otherwise, anxiety is going to disappear quickly when you know what to do about a thing. And anxiety, feeling anxious under these situations makes sense, because it helps you direct your attention to danger, and it helps you to go look for information. And I don't know if that's something that came to your mind when you thought about this before, but that's something that I really saw happening around me. People really went online to look for information and shared a lot more stuff than they usually do on social media. Everyone wanted to kind of understand what was going on. Anxiety does, of course, also influence how you perceive a risk, and then as a consequence of that, how compliant you're going to be. For example, with the COVID-19 anti-measures that were taken. And it might, in a pandemic, also influence a different unadaptive or protective behaviors, like stockpiling of food or not going to the hospital because you should. So anxiety is really probably the most relevant emotion we looked at, and maybe the most relevant in the early phase of a pandemic. Now, with regard to anger, the second negative emotion we looked at, it usually happens when you usually get angry when you're exposed to something negative that you don't want to accept, right? That you don't understand. So when there is some kind of boundary or limit that gets in your way. What's also usually the case with anger, at least in the way psychologists look at it, is that it's usually directed as a target. And so here we really didn't know what to expect with COVID, because a virus is hard to blame for what it's doing. At least in the early phases, it's not clear if people would actually then be angry about what was happening, or whether they would be more satisfied about the measures that were taken in the countries to protect them from danger. So here we really did not know what to expect. I think for anxiety, it's pretty clear that we expected an increase. And of course, when people get angry, this really undermines trust and reduces their compliance, which is, I think, in part what we're seeing in some of the countries today around the world. We also looked at sadness. We expected it to change because mostly the lockdowns really frustrated some of the important goals that people usually have in their everyday life, right? They want to be able to see their friends. They want to be able to go after their hobbies and stuff like that. And lots of this stuff was not possible. So we did expect sadness to increase. And what sadness usually does, so the function of sadness, as it's seen in psychology, is that it motivates us to seek support and to look for contact with other people. And this is also something I noticed happening at the very beginning. People really started engaging with other people online. And finally, we also just wanted to look at the positive side of things. Positive emotions usually occur when the opposite of all of that, what I just said, happens. So when everything's fine, right? And if they occur during the pandemic, that would be a really good sign, because they really help to reduce stress and depression, and they foster effective coping and trust. And so now let me get more into the details of the study. So as I said, we looked at social media data, specifically Twitter. And I think it's always important when we use that kind of data to think about whether it's actually the right data to measure what we're measuring, right? And to not just like use social media data because it's there, but to actually think about which questions you can answer that you can't answer with other types of data. And so surveys do, of course, have the advantage that they can recruit representative samples. Often they don't, but I think now during the pandemic, we saw more and more representative samples, actually specifically when surveys were about COVID. And the other big advantage is that you can directly ask people about how they're feeling. And that seems quite relevant with regard to emotions, like who is to judge what people feel, right? In the end, it's only them themselves. But surveys also have several limitations that social media data can make up for. And one really important one is that we have very, very frequent data, right? The data is just there, and you can look at hourly changes. Even we looked in this study at daily changes. And maybe even more important than that is that social media data allows you to look at historical data. So we had actually data from before the pandemic and for the early phase of the event, while organizing a survey study takes a while. Plus, this historical data also allowed us to correct for example, seasonal trends or weekly trends. We could simply correct for how our measures had behaved exactly 1 year earlier at the same time of the year. And so only like this, you can actually know that what you're looking at is more likely to be a result of what's happening, in this case, the outbreak of COVID-19. One other argument that is kind of the opposite of this, directly asking people about how they're feeling, is that when you analyze text that people write, when you don't ask them about their emotion, but it's just text they would have written anyway, you have no memory or reporting biases. When you ask people about how they're feeling, maybe they feel some things are more acceptable than others to say. Maybe they don't want to admit they're really, really anxious or really, really angry, and they wouldn't actually say, or maybe they just can't remember how they actually felt. Like often these survey questions are like, how have you felt during the last week? And from psychology, we know that especially for emotions, we have a very, very large memory bias. So like when you're asked now how you felt 1 week ago, that's going to be partially influenced by how you feel now. And I can really personally relate to this. Also, I find it really hard to remember how angry or anxious I was at certain moments in my time, in my life. I just can't feel it anymore, right? It's really something that happens in the moment. And that's a problem we don't have with social media data. And finally, in some ways, social media data allows you to include people that are hard to reach with surveys. So people who work, for example, people in lower middle income countries, non-English speakers. And in our study, this was definitely the case. I think we would have only done this study in Austria, where I'm based, if we hadn't had social media. And like this, we managed to include 18 different countries in which people speak different languages. Now to the actual specific methods of our study. I already said that we looked at expressions of emotion on Twitter. So it's really, really important that whenever I say emotion, this is just a shortcut for expression of emotion. This really just means what people say on social media. It does not mean that they actually said, that they actually felt what they wrote about. And the basic method we used is the linguistic inquiry and word count method. So this just means that you match the text of tweets to words that express a certain emotion. So there are basically dictionaries for different emotions. We use the ones for fear, anger, sadness, and positive emotions. And then you just match that to tweets, and every tweet that contains a word gets a score, is a hit for that emotion. And these dictionaries for look exist in six different languages, or actually more, but those are the 6 that we speak fluently in the team. So English, German, Spanish, Dutch, French, and Italian. And that allowed us to include 18 countries on 4 continents with a total of 8.3 billion tweets, which is quite a large sample. Now, it's important to say that we only looked at original tweets, not retweets. And this is important when looking at emotions, because I only want to know what people who feel an emotion express themselves. I don't want to know whether other people pay a lot of attention to, for example, an angry tweet. We know this happens, right? Emotional stuff attracts attention, but that doesn't mean that the people who then retweet this stuff actually feel the emotion themselves. We only looked at users located in one of the 18 countries we looked at. So we had location data, and we used follower limits to exclude bots and mass media. So basically a very low follower limit to not include bots, and a very high follower limit to exclude mass media. And then we just basically look at the % of tweets on each day that contain at least one emotion word. And we always calculate the change in comparison to a 2019 baseline. And we took a different baseline per weekday, because we know that these emotions have kind of a weekend pattern. Now, I want to start with showing you a couple of examples. I won't have time to go through all 18 countries. And unfortunately, I don't have Sweden. Otherwise, I would have included it. We would have needed a Swedish speaker. But if you want to check out if the countries you're most interested in are in our study, you can also just have a look at the link here where all of the countries are included. We're going to go through a couple of them and some summary measures for all of the countries now anyway, though. So basically, there's a lot to see on that slide. So maybe try to just stick to what I'm talking about. I'm going to lead you through it. In yellow, you see anxiety. That's really the emotion that changed the most in most of the countries we looked at. And what you can see with anxiety in Italy and Germany here is that we already had a first little spike of anxiety. I say little now, a 40% increase, you usually don't get that. So it's little in comparison to what happened afterwards, but you need quite extraordinary events usually to see such a large change. And that really happens around the time of the first case in Italy, which was the first country in Europe that had official case confirmations. And I think that was really just quite shocking for a lot of people, right? It's finally here. In Germany, it's much smaller, but you can still kind of notice at the moment where you have the first little gray circles, because those are the confirmed cases, you do see a little spike in anxiety and also anger here already. What's also really interesting, especially to compare this pandemic to other one-off events like a terrorist attack, is here the case of Germany. You can see that during or just after the terrorist attack in Hanau in Germany, you have a short spike of anger and anxiety that lasts about maybe 2-3 days. And then it very quickly goes back to the baseline. And then we see COVID-19 anxiety rising about the same time as the cases of COVID-19 also really start to clearly increase. So we really see this pattern for anxiety in all of the 4 countries I show you here, of anxiety increasing around the same time as cases. And you may then also notice that with the lockdown or a couple of weeks after the lockdown, anxiety starts to gradually decline. Most of the countries I show you here also show pretty clearly that sadness increased in many countries, although not as much as anxiety, and at a later point in time. So often this is a bit after the lockdown, like for example, here in Italy. Sometimes it also happens earlier. You might recognize this here in the US. So it could be either some kind of anticipation of what was coming, or then also people realizing what they were actually missing during the lockdown. So whenever I say lockdown here, we basically define the start of these social distancing measures as measures that concerned almost everyone in the country. So these are basically bar closures, school closures. So the stuff that really concerns most people, because often there were some more constrained restrictions already earlier on. So this is really stuff that concerns most people also who are actually on Twitter. And then finally, what you might already notice here, it's most clearly visible with anger, is that expressions of anger and frustration and violence became less around the time of the lockdowns as well. You see it a little bit here in Italy, but there are some much more clear cases than, for example, Spain or the US here. And finally, for positive emotions, we don't see much, which is already kind of partially good news. It seems that positive emotions were quite stable, at least in the 4 countries I show you here. And now one last important detail that you'll need to properly understand the next few slides. The bars you see at the bottom of each figure are basically indicating a 4-week period from mid-January to mid-February, which we used as a control period. And then you see 5 little bars, which indicates 5 weeks after the outbreak of COVID-19 in each country. So that's a slightly different time in every country. And we basically defined the day of the outbreak as the day with 30 cases. Now, I want to show you a couple more examples to just show you how similar these responses looked across different countries, across different languages, slightly different dictionaries we use to measure these emotions. You can really see the big increase in anxiety happening pretty much everywhere. You see some cases with very clear sadness increases. New Zealand, for example, responded really quite a while before the actual social distancing measures started. And you see in the 3 countries I show you here also this increase in anger and frustration, violence terms, most clearly maybe in Austria here. because I also want to talk about the more noisy countries we had in our data set, we had a couple of Spanish-speaking countries from South America. And my impression at that time in March, April last year was that in South American countries, there was a lot less attention directed to COVID. Still, I think it kind of just started happening there later. And here you see the example of Chile that was actually quite occupied with like social inequality protests or protests against violence against women. So these were kind of the big events there. And we were probably kind of too early to look at COVID-related emotions in these countries. We still wanted to include them in the sample in order not to cherry pick later on which countries we would actually include. So there's about 4 or 5 of those countries where these things are a bit less clear. Now, to give you a quick impression of how these responses compared across countries, here is just the average. So the 5 weeks after the outbreak average for each of those emotions. And you see that all countries actually showed an increase in anxiety compared to the baseline period. And this was quite large in some countries of up to 40%. And this is really on average, right? That's not the anxiety peak, but that's if you take the average across all of those 5 weeks. Most countries still showed an increase in sadness. In most countries, it's significant, maybe not in Germany and France anymore, those at the bottom here. And many countries showed a decrease in anger, although you might notice that, again, the anger change is much smaller than the anxiety change. And finally, for positive emotions, they were quite stable overall. So you see that all of the changes are rather small and the direction was inconsistent. So in some countries, people used more positive terms, in some a bit less, nothing very clear overall. And now to look at this in a more statistical way, to quantify really what we were seeing, we ran a generalized mixed effects logistic regression model that allows to take into account random variations between countries, because we really use different measures, right? We had dictionaries with different words in different languages and different other things that might have influenced these emotions happen in all of these countries. And we want to kind of model for this random variation and then look at the effects, if we account for that random variation, the effects that would still remain there across all countries. So these are basically the fixed effects coefficients from that model. So that's the variance that was really common across countries. And what you see here is that anxiety, as you might have already seen in the timelines I showed you, really increased very, very rapidly and early on at the very beginning. This is in week 1 after the day with 30 cases in the countries. In many countries, it was actually already a bit earlier. And this then stays at a very high level for about 2 to 3 weeks and then starts to gradually decline. For sadness and anger, we saw more gradual changes. So the highest values were reached in around week 3, which is kind of around the time of lockdowns in many countries. And for sadness, for anger, we saw the lowest values at around that same time. And finally, as I already said, positive emotions were quite stable. Overall, a slight decrease if we look at this common effect across countries. Now, one of the most obvious explanations for anxiety is, of course, the number of cases that different countries experienced. So here I want to say, although we have a really large sample in terms of tweets, right? Often social media studies focus on one country or a couple of cities or something like that. And we managed to include 18 countries in total, but still for calculating cross-country correlations, this is a very small sample of only 18. And so maybe don't look at the p-values too much, because they're really just, I mean, they're kind of significant, but they don't necessarily indicate whether a correlation is meaningful or not with 18 countries. So it's really more a question of how large the correlations are. And the correlations we observe are really quite considerable. So it seems that the number of cases do explain which countries experienced more anxiety. You can already see that pattern if you just look at the 5-week average on the left here. So countries who had more cases in those 5 weeks on average experienced more anxiety. But as you saw in the timeline plots I showed you, anxiety really responded mostly at the very beginning. And if we look at that time period, for example, the first week, and we look at how much did cases change from before that first week to that week, you can really see that countries with the strongest increases in COVID-19 cases experienced the most anxiety at that time. Now, as I said at the beginning, we were really interested in whether these emotions we were measuring were something collective, or whether it was just by coincidence, all people went through the pandemic at the same time and therefore felt the same thing at the same time. We found different kind of ways to try to look at this. None of this is definitive, of course. And the measures we used are just based on studies that show that individual emotions usually relax very quickly on social media. So I think in the study I'm citing here, it's a Facebook study, and they're really within minutes. When you express an emotion on Facebook and you post other stuff, even just minutes later, it's already a lot less emotional. And now, of course, what social interaction does, if you talk to someone about your emotion, that person might be empathic, right? They might also feel what you're feeling, or they might share with others that you're feeling that way. So they might start talking about how you're feeling. They might become anxious themselves. If you're anxious about something they're also worried about. And in that way, social interaction prolongs emotional responses. So this is something that David actually showed for the first time in a paper some of you might know, where he took a very similar approach to measuring collective emotions as we did now after a terrorist attack, the one in Paris. And he actually formalized this even in an agent-based model, where he showed that if you introduce social interaction in a model, this really does prolong for how long emotions last. And now I'm going to show you data on two potential indicators for this, the collective nature of what we're observing during COVID-19. The first is a memory coefficient in the time series of each emotion. And the second is simply the duration of the continuous time interval for which emotions changed in the case, which was quite impressive. So the memory coefficient actually sounds more complicated than it is. So basically what we're doing is that we're predicting the level of emotion on one day from the level on the previous day. And the thinking behind this is really just that if people express a lot of emotion today and then other people respond to that and start communicating about that, it's going to be related directly to the level of emotion you see on the next day. So this is really a day-to-day kind of pairwise correlation. And what you see that here in the plots at the top is the coefficient, this correlation coefficient from the model before the outbreak. And you see that there is social interaction, or the level on one day predicts the level on emotion on the next day. But in many cases, this is not different from zero. So it's not significantly different from what you would expect if people wouldn't interact. Now, after COVID-19, so during the outbreak, this is again the 5-week period we looked at, you see that this is really shifted upwards. So in many countries for anxiety, we had correlations that were close to 1, right, 0.8, 0.9, and only very few countries were still not significantly different from 0. And this is very, very similar for sadness, maybe a little bit lower overall. And so, of course, this does not necessarily mean that it was really social interaction that drove these correlations, but it's at least one potential explanation for what we observed, according to the paper by David on the Paris terrorist attack, where he formalized this a bit more than we did. Now, I think the data I show you now speaks an even clearer picture. You don't need to understand what memory coefficients in time series are. Here we really just basically counted the number of days in a row during which an emotion remained significantly higher or lower than the baseline from the previous year. And so what you can see in gray is always the length of these time periods before the first case occurred. So this is the entire year of 2019 until around mid-March in most countries. This is what you see in gray. In red, you see the time periods we observed after the first COVID case in each country. And if you look, for example, at the very first country, Australia here for anxiety, you can see that whenever anxiety was different from baseline, it was usually for 2 days, maybe 3. They had one case, which is the little circle here, the maximal case before COVID-19, which is maybe at around 5 days. But in the entire year of 2019 and the first 3 months of 2020, anxiety never increased significantly for longer than 5 days in a row, right? And now what you can see is that the red little dots, so the maximal values of the time period for which the emotions was different from the baseline, was much, much, much higher than that in most of the countries. It's really like periods of 1 month or longer for which these emotions did not go back to the baseline. For sadness, this is still quite a clear picture. It's a little bit lower, as I showed you before. The sadness responses overall were a bit less pronounced, but still in most of the countries, we had not observed such a long sadness increase before. Now, I think what's always important, of course, when we measure emotions in such an indirect way, is to think about whether we're actually measuring people's emotions. We have no final proof for this, of course, but there are a couple of hints that suggest that what we're measuring at least makes some kind of sense. It might not be the full picture, right? But we do measure something real. And what gives me a confidence in this are 5 different things that I want to show you now. The first one is very, very simple. It's basically what we call a psychologist's face validity. And the US is one of the good examples in our study for this. And this basically means that for different types of events, the emotions respond in the way you'd expect them to. So maybe the clear example here could be the death of Kobe Bryant. So that was, he was an American basketball player who died, I think, with his family during a helicopter crash. And the emotion you'd expect to increase is sadness, right? And that's what happens here. Blue is sadness. I think I didn't put the labels here. Yeah. Then the assassination of Soleimani by the US military, so Soleimani was an Iraqi military commander, was apparently quite controversial, right? And people then really talked about this a lot on Twitter, and we see increases not in positive emotions or sadness, but in anxiety and anger words. And the final example here would be Super Bowl. So for those of you who don't know, because you're not American, I didn't know it before these studies, that's a big, I think I even forgot the details now. It's a big sports competition event in the US, the National Football League or something like that. And there people really are anxious about who's going to win, right? Exactly during the event. That's why you see this very, very short 1 day spike here. So overall, it kind of seems to make sense when we look at different events in different countries and then the emotions that respond to it, it kind of seems to make sense. It's not complete craziness, at least. Now, a second thing we did is we compared with another measure of emotions and looked at how much the 2 measures correlate. And basically the measure we used here are model predictions from a machine learning model called Roberta, which was trained on human emotion labels for tweets. So that model basically got lots of examples of tweets with labels for different emotions and learned to predict them from the text of tweets. I'm going to show you that on the next slide. And the final thing we looked at that I'm going to show you afterwards were which words were most common in the tweets for each of these emotions. So which words might have driven the changes we observed. Now, regarding the correlation of the 2 different measures, the machine learning scores and these dictionary-based word counting scores that we used for the main study, you can see that they're not perfect, but they're actually quite considerable if you consider that both of these are just approximations of the thing we're really interested in, right? Machine learning is not perfect. That model makes a lot of errors, and even the human labels it was trained on were probably not perfect. People don't perfectly agree about which emotion is expressed in what text. And then still, if you correlate these kind of noisy machine learning scores with the kind of noisy word counting scores that we calculated, you see for some emotions quite substantial correlations. In some cases, they're a bit lower, but in any case, they're around at least 0.4, so kind of a medium correlation, and they go up to 0.7. So that shows at least that we're capturing something real, although there is also, of course, a bit of noise, which is always the case when you use social media data. And it's kind of just the disadvantage of you kind of make up for it by having loads of data, which kind of cancels out for some of the noise, hopefully. So this kind of shows that these methods don't work to predict the emotion of a single tweet, but overall, when you have a lot of tweets, you still capture some valid signal. And now finally, I've always find this super interesting is what does the actual data show? So which words were most frequent in which kinds of tweets? So you see on the left in gray simply how frequent certain words are in tweets in general, not tweets that contain specific emotion words. And the important message from that left plot is as kind of look at the words, and then we try to look at which of these words occur very, very often in general. So which of those words are not actually specific to an emotion. And a really good example here is right at the top, the word people, I think. It's really, really frequent overall. And so it's not necessarily linked to the emotions that we then analyze, although of course these words also occur in emotional tweets. People talk about people a lot. Another example is simply the smiley, the laughing smiley that people use a lot, which also occurs, I think, in all types of tweets we analyze here, even the sad ones. But you see that how often it's used kind of makes sense if you compare across different emotions. It's quite at the top for tweets just in general and for positive tweets on the right side. But it's much further down in the anxious tweets or in the sad tweets. In the angry tweets, apparently, it's also quite common to laugh about whoever or whatever you're angry or frustrated about. So here it's also quite at the top. So many words occur in these tweets in general, but the pattern of like where they rank, how frequent they really are, seems to make sense overall. Now, what you might also notice when you look at the positive dictionary is that it has a lot of words that are actually very, very frequent in general. So you have words like love. So people very, very often just say, I love, blah. You have words like good. You have words like thank. So these are words that are really used very, very frequently. They all exist in the plot on the very left. So we just talk about things being good very often without that being necessarily super positive. And I think that might be one potential reason for why we did not observe such a large variation in positive emotions, because most of the words that are in the positive dictionary we used actually are quite frequent words. And now to make this a little bit more clear, I've hidden all of the words that occur frequently in general and are not specific to an emotion. And here you can really notice that a lot of the positive words in the positive dictionary vanish. So they're just very, very frequent in general. And I think what you will notice for the other emotions is that the words that are remaining here, most of them really make a lot of sense. So risk, panic, fear, doubt, virus, feel, anxiety, all of these really might indicate that someone at least talked about something related to anxiety, even if they didn't feel it. I think the sadness words are quite clear as well, with the words like alone, lost, sad, I miss, and so on. There were even clearer examples. I wanted to take the US here because I also showed you the emotion timelines for the US just before. So we have the word isolation in lots of countries as well. So this really seems to be related somehow to this social distancing that we all had to go through at that time. And finally, I think the words for anger also kind of speak their own language quite clearly. So you can really see that this is a lot of swear words and people complaining about stuff. So all of these things seem to suggest that we're up to at least something. So of course, we don't directly ask people how they're feeling, but we seem to capture some signal there that seems to make sense. Now, if I summarize what I've shown you, we've really seen some of the longest emotion changes on social media that occurred in 2019 and 2020, but from David, who's been in computational social science much longer than I did, he even thinks that these are the longest in many countries that exist since we have social media data. So really quite impressive, and also kind of expected, I think, with the pandemic compared to other catastrophic events that usually don't last for that long. And as I've shown you, that anxiety really increased very early on and quite strongly. So there was a lot of strong initial uncertainty about the virus and about how to cope with that new threat. And then still after like 2-3 weeks, we did see a gradual decline. So people kind of got used to living with the virus. They had to get along, right? You can't stay anxious and fearful forever. With regard to sadness, we really think that our data shows or suggests that it was mostly an anticipation or response to the loss of social contact, to the loss of daily routines such as hobbies, people having to stay at home. And anger is a bit more tricky to interpret because it's a decrease. We're also still kind of working on that to look at which words actually decreased during the time. But what I think it could represent is really that people were, at least overall, not opposed to the measures. So this doesn't mean they were super happy about what was happening, but it means they were less angry and less frustrated than they usually are when they tweet stuff on Twitter. And here it's good to keep in mind that Twitter is really, in many countries, quite a political medium where people discuss day-to-day politics. And it seems that usually they discuss more controversial political topics where people disagree more than they actually did about the anti-COVID measures. And a final explanation that is a mere speculation, we didn't test this, is that crime rates were simply lower during lockdowns, and the anger dictionaries actually include words that describe violence, because these are often swear words as well. And so there might have simply been less descriptions of crimes happening, and that could also explain why we saw a bit of a decrease, although that is an open question. And finally, with regard to positive emotions, they remained quite stable, and this shows that people, at least in part, managed to focus in this early period of the COVID-19 outbreak. They managed in part to focus on positive aspects of the situation. And now I'm going to end with the obligatory sentence about why all of this is important, or might be important, in addition to just being curious about what actually happened. And what I think, what we are really seeing now in many countries is that understanding how people are feeling and maybe being able to put that into words really works wonders in risk communication, right? When people constantly feel misunderstood, that you don't realize what they're going through, they will stop doing what you need them to do during a pandemic. So I think in the end, knowing about how people are feeling is really important to nurture trust and to get through a pandemic in the best possible way. I think this might have worked better in some countries at the in the early phase, and it's not right now because people are more angry. And less anxious, and maybe also less sad. I don't know. At least I guess there's a lot more frustration by now. Now, with this, I want to thank all of you for your attention, and I want to point you to a couple of links that you might find interesting. I can unfortunately only offer an up-to-date dashboard for how these emotions developed throughout the pandemic until today for Austria, because this is the country we're in. You can find that here on the website of Max, who is one of the colleagues who participated in the study. You can also look at other countries that I haven't shown you on David's page. This is the same link as the one I've already shown you before. There's code and data as well, and you can always check out my website. And finally, I want to say thank you to the amazing team that was involved. And now I'm really curious to hear what you think about the study and questions you might